I realized something was wrong the moment I saw my name on the place card. Except it wasn't really my name anymore. It simply said +1. That was the first sign that the evening was not going to unfold the way I had imagined when I put on my navy dress and drove across town for my mother-in-law's birthday dinner. I remember standing just inside the entrance of the restaurant, the warm smell of grilled steak and buttered rolls drifting through the air, while the hostess smiled politely and handed me the small white card that would guide me to my seat. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary. +1. Not Margaret Collins. Not even Mrs. Collins. Just a blank label that could have belonged to anyone who happened to walk in off the street. For a moment I thought there must have been some mistake, but when I glanced around the room, I quickly realized it wasn't a mistake at all. The table had already been set for the family gathering, long and beautifully arranged beneath soft golden lights. My husband Daniel was there, sitting near the middle beside his sister. My mother-in-law Eleanor sat proudly at the head of the table, wearing a pale lavender sweater and the pearl necklace Daniel had given her years ago. And standing beside her, laughing a little too brightly, was Rebecca, Daniel's sister-in-law, the self-appointed planner of every family event since she married into the Hayes family 3 years ago. Rebecca was the one who organized this dinner. Rebecca was the one who sent out the invitations. And Rebecca, apparently, was the one who decided I would be introduced tonight as nothing more than someone's extra seat. I smiled politely at the hostess and walked toward the table anyway. No one likes causing a scene in a crowded restaurant, especially not on a birthday. As I approached, Rebecca spotted me first. Her expression flickered for half a second before she recovered and clapped her hands together as if she had just remembered something. "Oh, Margaret," she said brightly. "I didn't realize you were coming." Her voice carried just enough surprise that several heads turned in my direction. I felt Daniel glance up from his menu, his eyes meeting mine briefly before sliding away again. That small moment told me more than any words could have. He already knew. "Of course I'm here," I said gently, keeping my voice calm. "It's Eleanor's birthday." Rebecca gave a soft laugh that sounded pleasant to anyone who didn't know her very well. "Right, but when I was finalizing the guest list you mentioned you were busy this week. I just assumed you wouldn't make it." I didn't remember saying anything like that, but I also understood immediately what was happening. Rebecca had decided, quietly and carefully, that this celebration would go more smoothly if I simply didn't exist. And judging by the place card in my hand, she had gone through the trouble of redesigning the seating chart to make sure everyone else understood that message too. I could feel the eyes of a few relatives drifting toward me, waiting to see how I would react. That was the moment I realized something important. Rebecca expected me to be embarrassed. She expected me to apologize for showing up. Maybe even to turn around and leave so the evening could continue without awkwardness. Instead, I pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table where the card marked +1 had been placed. I set my purse carefully on the back of the seat and folded my hands in my lap as if everything were perfectly normal. Across the table, Rebecca's smile stiffened slightly. Daniel cleared his throat but said nothing. And Eleanor, sweet Eleanor, who had always tried to keep peace in the family, simply looked confused. No one spoke for a few seconds. The waiter arrived just then with a tray of sparkling water glasses, breaking the silence with the gentle clink of crystal. Conversation slowly resumed around the table, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way only I seemed to notice. Rebecca chatted about the decorations. Daniel discussed traffic on the drive over. Eleanor thanked everyone for coming. And I sat there quietly listening, watching, realizing that this strange little detail, my name disappearing from a place card, was only the beginning of a much bigger story. I sat there holding that little place card in my mind long after I had set it face down beside my napkin. Around me the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and soft background music, the kind that tries to make every celebration feel elegant and effortless. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of food that smelled warm and comforting, but I barely noticed any of it. Instead, I watched the people sitting across from me, people who technically belonged to my family, and I tried to understand when things had begun to feel so different. Rebecca was leaning slightly toward Eleanor, describing the cake she had ordered for the evening. It was apparently a 3-layer vanilla cake with fresh strawberries and buttercream frosting, something she said she had special ordered from a bakery across town. Eleanor smiled politely and thanked her, clearly pleased that someone had taken the time to arrange something nice. Rebecca spoke as though she had planned every detail with great care, as though the entire evening existed because of her effort alone. No one mentioned that I had been the one who reserved the private dining table 3 weeks earlier. No one mentioned that the restaurant manager had personally called me to confirm the menu and the reservation deposit. That detail had somehow disappeared from the story. Daniel finally looked up from the menu in front of him and cleared his throat quietly. For a moment I thought he might say something to smooth over the awkwardness of my strange introduction as a +1 guest. But instead he asked Rebecca whether the salmon or the steak special was better tonight. Rebecca smiled brightly and launched into a confident explanation about the chef's recommendations, and just like that the conversation drifted away from me entirely. It was subtle, the kind of social shift that happens so quietly most people do not even recognize it. But when you are the one being quietly moved to the edge of the table, you notice every small detail. I noticed how Rebecca gently redirected the conversation whenever someone asked me a question. I noticed how Daniel kept his eyes focused on the table instead of looking at me for too long. I noticed that my water glass was the only one that remained empty for several minutes before a waiter finally noticed. None of it was dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one said anything cruel. But the message was clear enough without words. I was present, but I was not meant to belong. At one point Eleanor leaned slightly toward me and gave me a warm but puzzled smile. "Margaret, I am glad you could make it tonight," she said softly. Her voice carried the gentle kindness that had always made me fond of her. "Rebecca told me you might be out of town this week." I felt a small pause settle over the table again. Rebecca's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, and Daniel took a long sip of water without looking up. It was a tiny moment, barely noticeable to anyone who was not paying attention. But I understood immediately what had happened. Rebecca had not only erased my name from the place card. She had quietly told everyone that I was not planning to come at all. That way my absence would feel natural. No one would question it. No one would ask where I was. I could almost admire the simplicity of the strategy. "My schedule changed," I replied gently, keeping my voice calm and friendly. "I would not miss Eleanor's birthday." Eleanor smiled warmly, clearly satisfied with that explanation, but Rebecca's eyes flickered toward me again. There was something calculating behind that polite expression now, as though she was trying to decide whether my presence would disrupt the evening she had carefully arranged. For the rest of dinner I said very little. I listened as stories were shared and laughter circled around the table, but I mostly observed. Because once you realize someone has been quietly rearranging your place in the family, you start noticing other things too. Small things. Patterns. The way certain invitations never reached you. The way plans were always finalized without your input. The way Rebecca seemed to position herself at the center of every gathering, while I slowly drifted further toward the edges. By the time the waiter returned to take our orders, I had already begun to understand something important about the evening. Rebecca believed she had control over how this story would unfold. She believed she had successfully rewritten the guest list and the narrative at the same time. And for now, I allowed her to keep believing that. I watched Rebecca carefully after that moment with Eleanor, because once you recognize a pattern it becomes impossible to ignore it. Dinner orders were placed one by one, and Rebecca seemed to guide the conversation as if she were conducting a quiet orchestra. She complimented the restaurant, joked about the drive across town, and reminded everyone how difficult it had been to reserve a private table on a Saturday evening. Each sentence was light and friendly, yet every detail pointed back to the same quiet message. She was the one who had organized everything. I noticed how easily the others accepted that version of the story. Daniel nodded along politely. Eleanor thanked her again for the effort. Even Daniel's cousin Mark commented on how thoughtful it was for Rebecca to plan such a lovely evening. I did not correct them. I simply folded my hands in my lap and listened, because sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could. When the waiter returned with fresh bread and small dishes of butter, Rebecca leaned slightly toward Eleanor and said something that caught my attention immediately. She mentioned that planning family gatherings could be complicated because not everyone is always reliable. She did not look at me when she said it, but the comment floated across the table like a carefully placed stone dropped into still water. I saw Daniel shift uncomfortably in his chair, though he still avoided meeting my eyes. Eleanor gave a polite laugh, clearly trying to keep the atmosphere pleasant, but I understood the meaning behind the sentence perfectly. Rebecca had already begun shaping the story of the evening long before anyone arrived. In her version, she was the responsible organizer. Everyone else was simply lucky to attend. And I was the one who could not be counted on. The thing about stories like that is they do not appear overnight. They grow slowly, detail by detail, until eventually people accept them without questioning where they began. As I sat there listening to the soft clinking of silverware, and the low hum of other conversations around the restaurant, I realized that this dinner was only the most visible moment of something that had been happening for months. I thought back to Christmas last year, when Rebecca had reorganized the seating arrangement at Daniel's parents' house, so that I ended up at the far end of the table beside two distant relatives I barely knew. At the time she said it was simply a matter of space. Then there was the summer barbecue, where invitations had apparently been sent through a group message I never received. Rebecca had laughed lightly and said she must have forgotten to add my number. Little explanations. Small accidents. Each one harmless on its own. Yet when I placed them side by side in my mind, the pattern was suddenly very clear. Rebecca had been moving me further and further away from the center of the family for quite some time. Tonight was simply the first time she had done it in a way that everyone could see, even if they did not fully understand what they were witnessing. The waiter arrived again with our dinners, setting plates carefully in front of each guest. The aroma of roasted vegetables and grilled fish filled the air. Rebecca complimented the presentation, Daniel thanked the waiter, and Eleanor lifted her glass of sparkling water to make a short toast about family and gratitude. Everyone smiled and clinked glasses politely. I raised mine as well, though my thoughts were elsewhere. Because while Rebecca believed she had quietly erased my place at the table tonight, she had overlooked one very important detail. And that detail had been arranged weeks earlier, long before she printed the place cards or finalized her version of the guest list. I looked around the table once more at the familiar faces, the candles flickering softly between us, the comfortable rhythm of conversation returning now that everyone was settled into their meals. Rebecca laughed at something Daniel said and reached for her glass with confident ease, completely certain that the evening was unfolding exactly the way she intended. I allowed myself a small, patient smile, because sometimes the most interesting part of a story is not the moment someone believes they have taken control. The interesting part is what happens next. By the time the plates were half empty and the candles had burned lower on the table, the atmosphere in the room had relaxed into that comfortable rhythm that comes when people believe an evening is going exactly as planned. Rebecca continued guiding the conversation with easy confidence, telling stories about a new bakery she had discovered and asking Eleanor about the vacation she had taken the previous spring. Daniel laughed at the appropriate moments and nodded politely, while the rest of the table followed Rebecca's lead without much thought. I listened quietly, taking small bites of my dinner, letting the warmth of the restaurant and the gentle background music fill the silence around me. No one seemed to notice that I was observing every small detail of the evening with unusual clarity. It was remarkable how quickly people adjusted to a narrative when it was presented with enough confidence. Rebecca had not needed to say anything openly unkind about me. She had simply placed me slightly outside the center of the evening, and everyone else had unconsciously accepted that arrangement. Yet the more I watched her, the more I realized that Rebecca believed this quiet exclusion was the final step of her plan. She believed she had already succeeded. That was the interesting part. Because while she had spent the past several weeks adjusting guest lists and shaping conversations, she had overlooked something that could not be rearranged quite so easily. The reservation for this dinner had never belonged to her. 3 weeks earlier, when Eleanor mentioned that she had not celebrated her birthday at a restaurant in years, I had quietly called the restaurant manager myself. I remembered the conversation clearly. His name was Thomas, and he had been very helpful when I explained that we needed a private dining table for 8 guests. He walked me through the menu options, confirmed the reservation date, and asked for a credit card to secure the booking deposit. I provided it without hesitation. At the time I did not think of it as anything particularly important. It was simply one of those small tasks people take care of when they want a family gathering to feel special. Yet as I sat there listening to Rebecca describe the difficulty of organizing everything, I realized she had assumed something that was not actually true. She assumed that planning the guest list meant she controlled the evening. The waiter returned to refill water glasses and clear the bread plates, moving carefully between the chairs so as not to interrupt the conversation. Rebecca complimented him on the service and asked whether the birthday cake could be brought out soon after the main courses were finished. The waiter smiled politely and assured her that everything was being prepared exactly as requested. His answer sounded ordinary enough, but I noticed the brief glance he gave me before walking away. It was the kind of glance that passes between people who share a small piece of information no one else at the table knows about. Rebecca, however, did not notice it. She continued speaking cheerfully about the cake, and how Eleanor deserved a celebration that felt memorable. Eleanor looked genuinely touched by the effort, thanking everyone again for coming together for the evening. I watched Rebecca carefully as she lifted her glass again and leaned closer to Eleanor, clearly satisfied that the dinner had unfolded according to her design. Her shoulders were relaxed now, her voice confident, her smile bright in the candlelight. She believed the story of this evening had already been written. But stories have a way of changing direction when a single overlooked detail comes into play. I set my fork gently on the edge of my plate and glanced toward the entrance of the private dining area, where the restaurant manager had been standing earlier. He had already confirmed the reservation details with me when I arrived. He had already asked whether everything was satisfactory. And most importantly, he had already reminded me that the payment authorization for the dinner would be processed at the end of the evening through the card that secured the reservation. My card. Rebecca laughed again at something Daniel said, completely certain that she had guided the evening exactly where she wanted it to go. I allowed the conversation to continue without interruption, my calm smile never leaving my face, because sometimes the most powerful response is patience. And patience, as it turns out, can make the final moment of a story far more memorable than anyone at the table expects. The plates were slowly cleared from the table one by one, and the gentle clatter of dishes being stacked onto trays blended with the low murmur of conversations around us. The restaurant had grown slightly louder as the evening progressed, but inside our private dining area the mood remained warm and comfortable. Rebecca leaned back in her chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the most important part of the evening had already been accomplished. She asked Eleanor whether she had enjoyed the salmon, and Eleanor nodded with a grateful smile, praising the tenderness of the fish and the seasoning of the vegetables. Daniel agreed that the meal had been excellent, and he lifted his glass again in another small toast to his mother. Everyone seemed pleased. The candles flickered softly along the center of the table, reflecting gently in the polished silverware that remained beside our plates. I sat quietly, hands folded near my napkin, observing the rhythm of the evening as it unfolded exactly the way Rebecca had intended. At least that was what she believed. Rebecca soon began discussing the birthday cake again, describing the bakery that had prepared it and the fresh strawberries that decorated the top layer. She spoke with enthusiasm, explaining that she had wanted something elegant but not overly sweet, something that would make the evening feel memorable for Eleanor. As she talked, the others listened with polite interest, and Eleanor looked genuinely touched by the attention. I noticed how Rebecca occasionally glanced around the table, almost as if she were measuring the success of the evening through everyone's reactions. It was subtle, but it was there. She wanted the evening to be admired. She wanted the story of the celebration to belong entirely to her. The waiter returned once more, asking whether anyone would like coffee or tea before the cake was brought out. Rebecca quickly answered for the group, suggesting that coffee would be perfect. Several people nodded in agreement, and the waiter left again to prepare the drinks. Rebecca smiled toward Eleanor and said that birthdays should always end with something sweet, and something warm to drink. Eleanor laughed softly and thanked her again. I noticed that Daniel was finally beginning to relax now that the dinner seemed to be reaching its final stage. His shoulders dropped slightly as he leaned back in his chair, clearly believing that the evening had passed without any complications. For a moment the conversation drifted toward old family memories, stories about past birthdays and small traditions that had been shared over the years. Eleanor recalled a birthday many years earlier when Daniel had surprised her with flowers delivered to her office. Everyone laughed gently as she described how embarrassed he had been when the entire office began applauding him. Rebecca smiled politely at the story, though it was clear she had not been part of those older memories. She had married into the family long after many of those moments had taken place. Still, she nodded as if she had always been there. After a few minutes, the waiter returned carrying a tray of coffee cups, placing them carefully in front of each guest. The aroma of fresh coffee spread through the room, warm and comforting. As he poured the drinks, Rebecca casually asked how long it would be before the cake was ready. The waiter smiled and said it would arrive shortly. Once again, his eyes flickered toward me for the briefest second before he stepped away from the table. It was a small moment, easily missed by anyone who was not paying close attention. Rebecca certainly did not notice it. She continued chatting happily with Eleanor about the cake decorations and the candles that would be placed on top. Daniel stirred sugar into his coffee and finally glanced in my direction for the first time in several minutes. Our eyes met briefly. There was a question in his expression, perhaps even a faint trace of concern, but he said nothing. I returned a calm, pleasant smile and lifted my coffee cup slowly, as though the evening were unfolding exactly as I expected. In truth it was, because while Rebecca had carefully arranged the guest list and shaped the conversation all night, there was still one moment she had not considered. The moment when the evening would quietly reach its final step. The moment when the restaurant would present the bill. And the moment when everyone at the table would discover exactly who had been holding control of the dinner all along. The candles had burned lower now, their small flames flickering gently in the quiet air of the private dining room, and the evening had reached that slow, comfortable stage where everyone believed the celebration was nearly complete. Coffee cups sat half empty on the table, and the soft clink of spoons against porcelain faded as conversation drifted into relaxed laughter. Rebecca appeared entirely satisfied with the night. She leaned back in her chair, one hand resting lightly on the table as she described the bakery that had prepared Eleanor's cake. According to her, it had taken 2 phone calls and a long drive across town to find the perfect place. She explained every detail with the calm pride of someone who believed she had orchestrated a flawless evening. Eleanor listened with appreciation, occasionally nodding and smiling, clearly touched by what she believed was Rebecca's effort. Daniel stirred the last of the sugar in his coffee and finally seemed to relax, his shoulders lowering as if he had been quietly waiting for the dinner to pass without tension. Around us the restaurant continued its gentle evening rhythm, waiters moving between tables, soft music playing somewhere beyond the dining room walls. It would have been a peaceful scene to anyone looking in from the outside. Then the waiter returned once more, this time carrying a small tray with several slender birthday candles and a polished cake knife. Behind him another server carefully brought in the cake Rebecca had described earlier. It was beautiful, exactly as she had promised. 3 layers of vanilla sponge, covered with smooth buttercream frosting and decorated with fresh strawberries arranged in a perfect circle along the top. Eleanor's eyes lit up immediately. The table filled with warm smiles and soft applause as the cake was placed gently in front of her. Rebecca leaned forward quickly, adjusting the candles with careful attention as though placing the final touch on something she had created herself. "Make a wish," she said brightly, and Eleanor laughed softly before closing her eyes for a moment. Everyone watched as she blew out the candles in one gentle breath. For a few seconds the entire table shared the simple warmth of the moment. The waiter then stepped forward and asked politely if anyone would like the cake sliced and served now. Rebecca answered without hesitation, saying that of course everyone would want a piece. The waiter nodded and began carefully cutting the first slice. Conversation resumed again, light and cheerful. Rebecca thanked the restaurant staff for the excellent service and joked that birthdays should always end with cake. Daniel agreed and several others nodded in approval. It was clear that Rebecca believed the evening had unfolded exactly as she planned. But as the waiter finished serving the slices and stepped away once again, another man quietly approached the table from the side of the room. I recognized him immediately. It was Thomas, the restaurant manager I had spoken with weeks earlier when the reservation was first arranged. He carried a small black folder in his hand, the kind restaurants used to present the final bill at the end of a meal. He waited politely until the conversation paused before placing the folder gently on the table near the center. "Whenever you are ready," he said kindly. Rebecca reached for the folder almost automatically, still smiling as if the final detail of the evening belonged to her as well. She opened it with casual confidence, glancing down at the receipt inside. For a brief moment nothing happened. Then the expression on her face shifted slightly, almost too quickly for anyone else to notice. Her eyes moved across the page again as if she were searching for something that did not make sense. The room grew a little quieter. Daniel looked toward her, confused by the sudden pause. Eleanor set down her fork slowly. Rebecca closed the folder again, her smile tightening just enough to betray the first hint of uncertainty. She looked toward the waiter who was still standing nearby, and said carefully that there must be some kind of mistake with the payment information. Thomas gave a polite nod, the calm expression of someone who had already expected the question. Then he spoke in a quiet, respectful voice that carried just clearly enough across the table for everyone to hear. "There is no mistake," he explained. "The payment authorization for the reservation was cancelled earlier this evening by the guest who originally secured the booking." For the first time all night, every pair of eyes at the table slowly turned toward me. For a moment no one spoke. The soft music from the main dining room continued playing somewhere beyond the walls, and the faint sound of dishes being moved in the kitchen drifted through the air. But at our table everything had gone completely still. Rebecca's hand remained resting on the black folder, her fingers slightly stiff against the leather cover as if she had forgotten how to move them. Daniel looked from the folder to the restaurant manager and then slowly toward me, confusion settling across his face in quiet stages. Eleanor blinked once, clearly trying to understand what had just been said. I remained seated calmly, my hands folded loosely in front of me on the table beside the untouched half-slice of birthday cake on my plate. The manager, Thomas, stood politely with the kind of patience that comes from years of working with complicated family dinners. Rebecca finally cleared her throat and gave a small, controlled laugh that sounded more strained than amused. She said that there must be some misunderstanding because the dinner reservation had obviously been arranged for the birthday celebration, and therefore the payment should already be handled. Thomas listened respectfully and then nodded once again. In a calm voice he repeated that the reservation had indeed been secured earlier, but the payment authorization attached to that reservation had been withdrawn a short while ago by the individual who originally provided it. His eyes shifted briefly toward me again before returning to Rebecca. The silence that followed stretched a little longer this time. Daniel turned fully in his chair and looked directly at me. "Margaret," he said slowly, as though he were still trying to piece together the meaning of the situation, "did you cancel the payment?" His voice was not angry, only uncertain. I lifted my coffee cup and took a small sip before answering. The coffee had grown slightly cooler but it still tasted pleasant. I set the cup back down carefully before speaking. "Yes," I said simply. Rebecca stared at me as though she had just heard something impossible. "You cancelled it?" she repeated, her voice tightening around the words. "Why would you do that?" I met her gaze calmly, noticing how the candlelight reflected in her eyes now that the easy confidence had disappeared from her expression. Around the table everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the explanation. Eleanor looked from Rebecca to me, clearly hoping there was some simple reason behind what had just happened. Daniel rubbed one hand slowly across the back of his neck, the way he often did when he sensed tension building in a room. I allowed a quiet moment to pass before I answered. "Because," I said gently, "I realized something earlier tonight." Rebecca frowned slightly. "And what exactly did you realize?" I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands again, my voice remaining calm and steady. "I realized that according to the seating arrangement and the introductions this evening, I am not actually a guest who belongs at this dinner. I am apparently just a +1. The words settled over the table like a slow ripple across still water. Rebecca's mouth opened slightly but no response came out immediately. Daniel glanced down at the place card beside my plate, the one I had turned face down earlier. Eleanor looked confused again, her brows pulling together gently. I continued speaking in the same even tone. "And it seemed to me that if I am only a guest who was not even expected to attend, then it would not be appropriate for me to be responsible for paying for the entire dinner." The manager remained quietly beside the table, his professional expression carefully neutral. Rebecca's face had now shifted from confusion to disbelief. "You are saying you booked this dinner?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. 3 weeks ago, I replied calmly. "I spoke with Thomas here and arranged the reservation when Eleanor mentioned she had not celebrated her birthday at a restaurant in years." Eleanor turned toward me with visible surprise. "Margaret, you did that?" she asked softly. I nodded once. Of course. It was meant to be a gift. Rebecca looked from Eleanor to Daniel and then back to me, the color in her cheeks deepening with each passing second. Around us the quiet restaurant continued its evening routine, but at our table the story of the night had suddenly changed direction in a way no one had expected. The silence that followed my explanation felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that evening. Rebecca was still staring at me as though she had just discovered a detail that did not belong in the story she had carefully arranged. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair, his eyes moving from my face to the manager, and then back to the black folder resting on the table. Eleanor looked genuinely surprised now, her expression soft but puzzled as she tried to process what I had just revealed. For several seconds no one spoke. The only sound was the faint clink of a fork against porcelain, as someone at the far end of the table adjusted their plate. Rebecca finally straightened in her chair and drew in a slow breath, clearly trying to recover the confident tone she had carried throughout the evening. Well, she said carefully, if there was confusion about the reservation, we can simply settle the bill now. Her voice sounded calm on the surface, but the tightness around her words betrayed the sudden pressure she was feeling. Daniel nodded quickly, eager to smooth the moment over. Yes, that is not a problem, he added. We will just take care of it. The manager remained politely beside the table, waiting without any sign of impatience. Rebecca opened the folder again and glanced down at the receipt. This time she studied it more carefully. The number printed at the bottom of the page seemed to surprise her more than anything else had that evening. Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly tried to mask the reaction. A dinner for 8 people at a private dining table, complete with a custom cake and multiple courses, was not exactly a small expense. Daniel leaned closer, trying to read the total as well. I watched both of them quietly, the candlelight flickering softly between us. Rebecca cleared her throat once more. It appears the restaurant requires a card to process the payment immediately, she said slowly, as though hoping someone else might volunteer first. Daniel reached for his wallet but hesitated when he saw the total more clearly. Eleanor looked uncomfortable now, clearly unhappy that her birthday dinner had turned into an awkward financial discussion. I spoke gently before the silence could grow heavier. Rebecca, I said calmly, I want to make something very clear. When I reserved this dinner, it was meant to be a gift for Eleanor. I was happy to pay for the entire evening. Eleanor's expression softened again when she heard that, though confusion still lingered in her eyes. Rebecca, however, looked even more unsettled now. Then why cancel the payment? She asked quickly, unable to hide the frustration in her voice. I held her gaze steadily. Because, I replied in the same calm tone I had used all evening, a gift should come from someone who is welcome at the celebration. The words settled quietly across the table. Daniel looked down at the place card beside my plate again, finally noticing the label that had been printed on it. Eleanor followed his gaze and slowly reached forward to pick up the card herself. She turned it over in her hand and read the words silently. Her expression changed almost immediately. Rebecca shifted in her chair, clearly realizing that the small detail she had arranged earlier was now being examined by everyone at the table. That was just a seating adjustment, Rebecca said quickly, her voice losing its earlier confidence. There was not enough room on the chart. Eleanor looked up from the card and glanced around the table. But Margaret is Daniel's wife, she said softly. Why would she be listed as a +1? Rebecca did not answer right away. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly, as though he had finally begun to understand the quiet tension that had been building all evening. Around us the restaurant continued its normal rhythm, servers moving through the dining room and distant conversations blending into the background. Yet at our table the atmosphere had changed completely. Rebecca closed the folder again and placed it back on the table with a stiff movement. The confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone now. Eleanor set the place card down carefully beside my plate and looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and concern. I returned her gaze with the same calm expression I had worn all night, because sometimes the most powerful moment in a story is not the loudest one. Sometimes it is simply the moment when everyone finally sees what has been there all along. For several long seconds no one spoke after Eleanor set the place card back on the table. The tiny rectangle of paper looked strangely important now, lying beside my plate where the candlelight illuminated the simple printed words that had quietly explained everything. Rebecca stared at it as though she wished it would disappear. Daniel looked down at it as well, and I could see the moment when the realization settled into his expression. Eleanor folded her hands slowly in front of her and turned her attention toward Rebecca, her voice gentle but steady. She asked a simple question that hung in the air longer than anyone expected. She asked why Margaret, Daniel's wife, would ever be listed as a +1 at a family birthday dinner. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The confident explanation she had offered earlier in the evening seemed harder to find now. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing between Rebecca and me as though trying to understand how the evening had reached this point without him noticing sooner. Around us the restaurant continued its quiet routine, the distant sound of dishes and low conversations reminding us that the rest of the world had not stopped simply because our table had fallen silent. Rebecca finally drew in a breath and tried to speak again, saying that the seating chart must have been printed incorrectly, and that the situation had clearly been misunderstood. Her voice carried an edge of frustration now, the careful calm she had maintained earlier beginning to crack. Eleanor listened without interrupting, but the concern in her eyes did not fade. Daniel leaned forward slightly and turned the place card over in his hand again, studying it as if hoping another explanation might appear on the other side. When he looked back at Rebecca, his voice sounded quieter than before. He asked whether she had really arranged the seating chart that way on purpose. Rebecca did not answer right away. That hesitation spoke louder than anything she might have said. I watched the exchange calmly, my hand still resting loosely on the table beside the empty coffee cup. The moment did not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. The truth had already done its work. Eleanor looked toward me again then, her expression soft with both gratitude and regret. She said that she had no idea I had planned the dinner or reserved the table, and that she would never have allowed such a misunderstanding if she had known. I gave her a small reassuring smile and told her gently that the evening was still meant to celebrate her birthday. Rebecca shifted again in her chair and reached for the black folder, clearly eager to move the situation forward. She took out her credit card and placed it inside, telling the manager that she would handle the payment. Thomas nodded politely and took the folder, thanking her before stepping away toward the front desk. The tension around the table eased slightly once the practical matter had been settled. Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back again, still looking thoughtful. Eleanor reached across the table and briefly touched my hand, her way of acknowledging what had happened without making the moment even more uncomfortable for the rest of the group. A few minutes later the manager returned with the receipt and Rebecca signed it quickly, her movements a little sharper than they had been earlier in the evening. Conversation resumed in small pieces after that, though it no longer carried the same effortless tone as before. Eventually chairs began to move back from the table and coats were gathered as the dinner came to an end. I stood quietly and picked up my purse from the back of my chair. Eleanor hugged me warmly and thanked me again for arranging the evening, telling me that despite everything she truly appreciated the effort. I wished her a happy birthday once more and assured her that she deserved a celebration. Daniel lingered nearby as the others began walking toward the exit, looking as though he wanted to say something but was still searching for the right words. Rebecca was already ahead of us near the door, speaking briefly with the hostess. I slipped my coat on and followed the others toward the restaurant entrance. The night air outside was cool and calm, carrying the distant sounds of traffic along the street. As we stepped out onto the sidewalk, I realized that the evening had ended very differently than Rebecca had planned. She had tried to remove my place at the table without anyone noticing. Instead, everyone had seen exactly where I belonged.